So just as we're starting chapter 5, it's worth just looking ahead. Chapter 5 is about hypothesis testing, but we are dealing with continuous variables. Chapter 6 is hypothesis testing using discrete variables, where there's a difference in things. And chapter 7, you might think of a strange title called Errors in Hypothesis Testing, or basically it's dealing with what could go wrong and understanding the implications of that. But hypothesis testing first of all. First of all, imagine a court in this country trying a defendant. What premise do they start from in this country?
Technically you're innocent until proven guilty.
Yes, the defendant is innocent until proved guilty. Everybody is assumed innocent until they are proved beyond reasonable doubt that they are not innocent and they are guilty. Okay? The proof must be beyond all reasonable doubt. The trial starts off with the judge and the jury assuming innocence. In our testing, we are always going to start with a null hypothesis, which we will denote H subscript 0. And we will always assume that to be true. So I would write down at least the bold bit there. So up to the word true, write that bit down. We will always start any hypothesis test with a null hypothesis, which is assumed to be true. It's the equivalent of a defendant being innocent. And this will mean a bit more once we get stuck into an example.
Off topic, but is this a permanent rule change?
Yes. So if we have a null hypothesis, which is like he's innocent, we also need an alternative hypothesis, which is like the guilty plea, or the guilty being found guilty. So we also, right at the start, state an alternative hypothesis, which we denote as H subscript 1, which at the start we assume to be false. But we can only ever conclude one of these hypotheses is true. We will always conclude that either H0 is true, or we will conclude H1 is true. There are no other options. So depending on how you write your alternative hypothesis and how you write your null hypothesis, you could come to different conclusions.
Is it H1 or H0?
That's H1 for the alternative hypothesis and H0 for the null hypothesis. Okay? So, in a court case, the evidence comes from the prosecution, and you have the defence as well. Our evidence will come from a test statistic, which is calculated from the sample. And we will use that as our evidence. And by assuming the null hypothesis to be true, which is where we're starting from, it's possible to calculate probabilities relating to that test statistic. And we calculate something called a critical value, such that if the probability of exceeding that value is significantly small, if it's significantly unlikely to have happened, then we say, in that case, we'll call them guilty. Okay? And you'll see that happening later on. So we calculate a critical value, and if the probability of exceeding that is so small, and we usually use 5% as being so small, the question will always tell you what percentage to use, we would reject the null hypothesis, and therefore we would have to accept the alternative hypothesis. That is the only other option. So this slide here is a crucial one for this chapter. This tells you the steps you take for any hypothesis test, and you can get this one copied down. Okay, so step 1 for any hypothesis test is defining and stating and writing down the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. I'll explain the 1 or 2 tail bit in a minute. Deciding on a significance level is usually done for you in the question, to be honest. Calculating the critical value in the critical region, calculating the test statistic, deciding on the outcome, and the important thing at the end is writing a sentence in words, not numbers, relating back to the original context of the question.